I'm not against hunting. I know it ain't the popular stance to take these days. There's a bunch of righteous people who would think I'm a monster for even suggesting hunting can be good for the local environment, but I don't really care. I think hunting's cool. I always did. But you'd never catch me anywhere near a forest, ever. I used to go hunting with my uncle during deer season, ever since I was a kid, but we stopped doing it when I was 11. My uncle was a crappy shooter, and I was too young to handle weapons, so we would lay traps, wander around, and on the rare occasion we caught anything worth killing, we would take it back home and he'd show me how to skin it. It was cool. I enjoyed it even if I was just a little kid, and we would have continued to do it if not for our last trip. It wasn't supposed to be an overnight stay. We didn't pack a lot of food and water and didn't have sleeping tents or even sleeping bags either, but my uncle insisted that it would be okay to keep looking for game after sundown. It was one of the most stupidly overconfident moves I've ever seen, and it backfired hard. We got lost. It didn't even take long, maybe an hour and a half if I'm being generous. We had a map, but there were only a few reference points we could use, and we couldn't find any of them. We had walked the whole day, and I was getting way too tired to function properly. I was just a kid after all, and that hike would have been hard for an adult, both mentally and physically. Eventually, by sheer luck, we found a creek that wasn't on our map, which prompted my uncle to start spouting bullshit about how we were in the clear and would be able to get back home in no time. But by that point, I just couldn't anymore. I was too tired to keep moving. He tried to explain to me how we just needed to follow the creek and eventually would hit a river that was on our map, and then we would be able to navigate back to our car. But I didn't care anymore. I wanted to rest. My uncle tried to reason with me, tried to make me understand Mom would get worried sick, and that we didn't have any sort of protection from the elements. He even told me he would carry me if I wanted him to, but I didn't budge, and he ended up giving in, which was perhaps the second dumbest thing he did that night. We started a small fire and huddled together. He hugged his Winchester and made a makeshift pillow with his bag, which prompted me to do the same thing with my bag while holding my switchblade in my pocket. The ground was awfully cold and hard, and it felt itchy, but I ended up falling asleep anyway. I couldn't have slept for more than 2 hours before I heard it. The scream, an awful scream coming from our right, from the other side of the creek. "What was that?" I whispered, leaping to my feet. My uncle was already up and holding his gun in his hands. He started saying something, but before the words even left his mouth, we heard it again. It sounded like a woman, screaming at the top of her lungs as if she were being stabbed. I stepped forward, 2 little steps before my uncle pulled me backward by my jacket. "Climb that tree. I'll go check it out. Don't get down unless you hear my voice," he told me, pointing to a tree behind us and giving me one of our flashlights. It was an order. I wanted to protest, but I didn't. This was serious, and I wasn't going to disobey when it really mattered. So I went. I climbed the tree and stayed there, looking down from the branches. It wasn't a tall tree, but it was tall enough that someone wouldn't be able to see me from down there without looking up, which at the time seemed like a blessing. My uncle started moving in the direction of the scream before I was even done climbing, and once I was up there, we heard it again, and he bolted toward it. He moved as silently and fast as he could, and after a few seconds disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone there, up that tree. Forests are dark places, quiet places, but they're usually alive. The screams were weirder than usual, but you'd hear a bunch of weird stuff if you paid attention. But nothing ever prepared me for the almost inaudible sound of soft paws pressing against the ground, breaking small twigs and rustling dry leaves. I looked down, my eyes struggling to see beneath me. I heard a scream, another blood-curdling scream. I felt as if I were dying. I had my flashlight in my hand, and I shouldn't, but there was a shadow there, a shadow making inhuman noises while it looked around our small makeshift camp. So I did. I turned it on. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't a human at all. It was a goddamn mountain lion. When the light went on, it startled the thing. But then, it looked up and saw me, and it was my turn to scream, because it lunged at the tree and started climbing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't fight it and I couldn't outrun it. There was nowhere to run to. so I just jumped. I jumped from the tree into the ground before it even reached the branches and fell on my right leg, breaking it. I screamed again as I landed, and all I could think was, I'm dead. The lion quickly jumped too. It landed awkwardly, but nowhere near as terribly as I did, and for some reason, that just made it seem scarier. That was a real predator. It wasn't playing pretend like my uncle and I were. It was going to kill me and feel nothing. Before it reached me, my uncle shot at it. He missed, but the sound was enough. It got scared and ran. I got off by a second or two at the most. It would have pounced on me, and I doubt I'd be able to recover, even if my uncle killed the thing. Needless to say, we didn't go back to sleep. My uncle carried me up the creek until we found the river, and then to our car. He took me directly to the hospital, and I just never went to the forest with him or anyone again. I don't want to, and whenever someone asks me why, I just tell them the truth. There are killers there. I grew up on a farm. When I wasn't working the farm or in school, I was playing in the woods that surrounded our property. I knew every inch of those woods, and my dad would take me there to go turkey hunting for Thanksgiving. So I've always felt safe in the woods. Not that I'd ever hang around in there after dark. The woods weren't haunted or anything, but there were wild bears and venomous snakes. I moved away to go to college and got a job in the city. I married a girl named Leah and had a couple of kids, Scott and Jason. As great as living in the city was, I felt Scott and Jason were missing out on being kids and playing in the woods as I did when I was their age. So imagine my excitement when my workplace relocated me to a town that was walking distance from a national park. I was so excited to take my boys out exploring in the woods. I took the boys and Leah into the woods at least once every weekend and taught them how to find their way with a compass, how to fish and hunt, and most importantly, how you should never go into the woods by yourself. I made sure Scott and Jason knew to always use the buddy system whenever they went off to play in the forested area behind our house, to hug a tree and blow a whistle should they get lost, and to always return to the whistle I kept around my neck. Fortunately, they were good friends and did practically everything together. One year, when Scott and Jason were 10 and 8 respectively, I decided to reward them for a good school year by taking them camping in the national park. Everyone was excited, especially Jason, who wanted to play with the compass he had gotten for Christmas the previous year. After getting to our campsite and setting up, we sent the boys off to play nearby, while Leah and I enjoyed some time alone. We got to talking when I got the strange sense that we were being watched from the south, just beyond the stream. I grabbed a water bucket and headed to the stream. That way, in case we were being watched, I could say I was filling a bucket of water. I filled the bucket and scanned the tree line. There was nobody there. I kept my eyes peeled, but I was feeling pretty foolish. What if I'm just seeing things? But I had been in forested areas long enough to know that if something didn't feel right, it probably wasn't right. I hurried back to the fire with the bucket. "Have you seen the boys?" I asked Leah. "Not since you sent them off. They promised to be back before sundown. Why do you ask?" Just curious." I was still feeling spooked from the strange feeling, so I continued watching for the boys. As the sun got closer to setting, Leah set up the campfire for cooking, and we prepared a quick meal. As the sun sank lower and lower in the sky, the more apprehensive I grew. I wanted nothing more than to get the boys and get us out of there. I was about ready to blow my whistle when Scott and Jason crashed through the trees. Their faces were white, and there was a shocked look on their faces. "Where have you guys been?" I asked, trying to hide how angry I was at them for taking so long. "We got chased by a man," Scott blubbered, clearly shocked. "A man?" I asked. "We were playing with the compass when this guy showed up. He smelled bad and was wearing rags," Jason said. "He was carrying this long knife with him and asked what we were doing in his woods." "His woods?" Leah asked from the campfire. "He said the woods had been in his family for generations and that the government had no right to take it away from him. He drew his knife and told us to run, so we did," Jason said. While I was trying to process the strange story the boys had told me, I heard a loud snap of a twig breaking from the area where the boys had crashed through. I took out my flashlight and shone my light into the area where the sound had come from. Sure enough, there was this huge man, wearing the rags of a Boy Scout uniform way too small for him, and smelling like he hadn't had a shower in several days. In his hand was a long and sharp machete. He glared at us. "That's the man!" Scott shouted, pointing. I grabbed the boys and screamed at Leah to run back to the car. We got out of there, running to the area where we had parked our car, not even bothering to put out the fire. Once we got in the car, we drove to the ranger station and reported what had happened. The rangers shared a look. This made me wonder if this was not the first time they had heard of him. They agreed to check it out and told us to stay put at the ranger station. 20 minutes later, they asked us to come down to the campsite. We went down there and saw that the place had been ransacked. Our tents had been slashed and our belongings scattered everywhere and in the still burning fire. The rangers told us we were lucky that the belongings and equipment were the only things that had been destroyed. We haven't been back since. The boys refused to play in the forested area behind the house. I don't blame them. The park rangers called the cops, who promised us they'd catch whoever was responsible. But I still get a chill whenever I get the strange sensation that we're being watched. I've always been a pretty active person. For reference, I'm a 22-year-old petite Hispanic woman who grew up in a family full of boys. So while I loved playing with my Barbies when I was a kid, I also enjoyed playing manhunt and football with my cousins during the summer, and then going camping during the fall. Now, as an adult, I'm still as active and exercise every day as a way to de-stress after work. My favorite way to get my steps in is to go hiking on my local trail. The scenery is beautiful, just miles and miles of wildlife, so it was the perfect place for me to tune out the world and jog my stress out. I run at the same time every week since I have a set schedule and get anxious when things don't go according to plan. One night during early winter, around 6 in the evening, I was doing my evening run, enjoying the sounds from the bugs and wildlife around me, when I heard a sound that instantly made me stop in my tracks. It was a baby, or rather a baby crying, somewhere deep in the woods. What I did next, I know was stupid, but at the time, I wasn't thinking about anything but the fact that during the winters where I live, it can reach temps of negatives during the night. I kept thinking of the baby, probably lost in the woods, and no one was looking for them. So I did what I thought was right at the time. I went toward the sound of the crying baby. Within a minute of walking toward the crying, I noticed that the sound was coming from deeper in the forest than I expected. I quickly crossed the marked trail, uneasy as I went off track, but confident since I knew the forest well, as I kept jogging quickly toward the lost child. When I was only a few yards from where the child was supposed to be, the crying abruptly stopped for a brief moment, but it was enough for me to hear it. A click. I froze in place and listened carefully as I heard another click right before the crying started over again. And then I realized that the closer I was to the sound, the more off it sounded, almost robotic. I took a couple of cautious steps toward the crying again, and that's when I saw the cause of the crying. I picked it up, and my hands shook. In the middle of the forest, dirty and obviously fake, was a toy baby doll that was still crying uncontrollably. A branch snapped from the side of me, and I saw someone hide behind a tree. Before my mind could catch up with my body, I was sprinting in the direction I came, and quickly I heard heavy footsteps come from behind my retreating form. I was freaking out, but since I was a long-distance runner and kept track of landmarks as I went off track, I was able to get back onto the marked path within minutes. The steps stopped behind me at some point, but I didn't stop running until I was back to the beginning of my trail and back at my car. I got in, almost in tears because I couldn't find my keys at first, and tore out of there like my butt was on fire. I heard the cries of a baby again, and realized that in my rush to get away, I had taken the toy baby with me. I remember opening the window and chucking that toy out of the window. As soon as I calmed down enough, and there were enough miles between me and that forest, I called the police and told them what happened to me. That's when they informed me that they had a report that sounded exactly like mine from the week before. Only the woman who heard it didn't try to follow the crying and instantly reported it to the police. But by the time they checked, whoever was trying to lure the woman away was long gone. And since I threw the toy doll in the middle of some random road, they couldn't dust it for prints to see if the guy was in the police database. I don't regret throwing that doll on the road. But I do regret that I didn't give it to the police, because that guy is still out there, trying to lure women deep into the woods to do God knows what to them with the sounds of a distressed baby crying. I haven't been to that forest since, and I don't hike alone anymore. I used to love spending time in nature when I was younger. I grew up and it was something that never left. The only time that love wavered was after I spent a few weeks working at a summer camp in the middle of the wilderness. It was for a church that my grandparents used to attend when I was a small child. This camp was in the middle of the forest and it was primitive. It didn't have air, televisions, and everything was shared. Right away, I didn't like being there, but I couldn't just walk away. I decided I'd stick it out. Looking back, I should have left right then. What started out as a part-time summer job slowly turned into something else. Despite screaming kids of all ages at any given time, there was something desperately wrong with the woods themselves. I never felt quite free like I had in many other woods. What really got me was one portion in particular, though. It was right at the edge of the camp's borders. If you looked one way, you saw the pool. The other way held a wide expanse of just wilderness. You could barely see through the trees, and when the sun went down, you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. One night, we did a camp-wide scavenger hunt, and we were set to groups of 5. We were supposed to meet back at the sawdust floor chapel within 2 hours. Whoever made it first won. Well, things were going great until about an hour in. I did a head count and realized we were missing one. I tried not to panic and instead called the boy's name. But when I got a response, it didn't seem reasonable. The reply came from beyond the border, in the woods. The other kids looked around, and all denied seeing him go past them. But instead of wasting time, I found another counselor to watch my group, and figured I'd just use my light to go and get him. Walking into the woods, I used the light on the ground so I wouldn't step on anything, or, run into wildlife that could potentially bite me. I remember giving myself pep talks as I went deeper into the darkness. After I made it far enough that the light behind me was dimming, I called his name again. For a few moments, there was nothing but crickets. I tried again, and this time, I heard giggling. It wasn't the innocent giggles either. This sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. It sounded almost like laughter, emanating from every direction. Then, I heard footsteps approaching. It sounded close enough that if I turned, something would be there. I didn't want to know, so I kept going forward. This time, a ruffle of leaves came from in front of me. I stopped cold. I used my flashlight and saw the bush moving with my own eyes. I hesitated as I sidestepped away. I tried to push the image away. It seemed the deeper I went into the woods, the more disconcerting things became. It was like I had walked in a circle. I was sure I passed the same weird-shaped tree already. I also lost track of the time. It seemed like hours had passed when I made it to the same tree again. Defeat flooded me, and I was just about ready to turn around, when, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of something child-sized running through the trees at full speed. I could see the branches as they were unceremoniously shoved out of the way. Not hesitating, I ran full speed. I didn't want him to trip or end up hurt. Darting after him, I started to hear more laughing. When I was just about to catch him, I tripped and landed in the middle of an open slice of land. However, he wasn't there. Nothing was. Even the insects stopped talking, and it felt like I was in my own soundproofed room. Then, all of a sudden, it wasn't quiet anymore. I heard it low at first. It was faint, but there. It was like I could feel it in my palms as it vibrated off the damp earth beneath me. It was a rumble. No, it was a growl. Not only was it a growl, but it was behind me. My mind wandered through what type of animal it could be, but this wasn't any animal I had heard before ever. This was carnal and enraged. Not really wanting to, but knowing that not having a clue what was behind me left me at an extreme disadvantage, I forced myself to roll onto my back. Looking into the trees behind me, I saw something. I say something because I don't know what in the world it was. It had eyes that were red. It felt like they were glowing. Not only that, but where they were resting told me whatever it wasn't small. Slowly, I made myself stand, backing up slowly. The eyes stayed in place. Considering I knew roughly how the camp was set out, I hoped that if I ran left and back, I'd end up in the vicinity, and that's what I did. I took off at full speed. The light I had bounced from rock to tree as it jostled with me. From behind, I could hear laughter, followed by a growl. I watched to make sure I dodged roots and everything for fear of what happened if I fell. I felt my sides start to cramp, and I willed myself to just make that last stretch. Horrified, I heard a final snarl that seemed to be right at my heels, but at the last minute, I saw safety. I saw light. Instantly, it was gone. The air was less oppressive, and I just knew nothing would be behind me. When I busted through the tree line, I was met by another counselor. Breathless, I ushered her away from the woods and towards the cabins. I was nearly in tears as I explained that I couldn't find one of the kids, and I went after him, but there was something in the woods. The other counselor's eyes changed, and I knew I said something wrong. Still, I pushed on. It wasn't until tears were actually falling, and I was talking about getting a search team, that she stopped me. She assured me things were fine, and I was confused as to why she didn't seem concerned. As we walked inside, I saw my camper. He was sitting unharmed. I asked the other counselor where he was and how long he'd been here, and she explained that he had accidentally gotten tangled up with her campers as we passed them before even entering the pool house area. The boy looked just as confused. I asked him why he went to the woods, and he looked back at me before solemnly telling me that he never went in the woods. He was scared of the boogeyman.